the hard security and revival of defense industrial capacity in Europe, I invite on stage Martin L., columnist and analyst, Hospodarskie Noviny from Czech Republic. And I hope
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good morning still. We didn't have lunch. My name is Martin L. I work for Czech Economic Daily, and I will have a pleasure to talk with a couple of clever guys about how to revive defense industry in Europe. So please welcome on the stage Major General Remus Bondor, Chief of Strategic Planning Directorate, Defense Staff of Romania. Andrew Mikta, Director of the Scope of Strategy Initiative, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council of the United States in Washington. And Radu Tudor, Political and Defense Analyst. Gentlemen, take a seat. On the last note, it was cancelled by Emmanuel Ioana, General Director of RomArm. So we are going to speak about defense industry without defense industry being presented on the stage. So there is a microphone, and if there is anybody from the defense industry, please form the line there. We will have a couple of questions, or you will have an opportunity to speak to us, please. Gentlemen, let's start with General Bondor and with his remarks on where we are, because he's the end user of what we as a societies are supposed to produce on larger scale than we are producing now. General.
Thank you, Martin. I think it's okay.
Yes.
So, yes, indeed, we are the end users. And the Romanian Armed Forces is in a dynamic accomplishment of the building response to any threat that can come against the independence, sovereignty, and integrity of the country. And also, we are heavily engaged in fulfilling our engagements towards NATO and towards our partners. Let's talk about security, and we can divide security into two parts: hard security, that we will discuss today, and soft security. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, I think the threat in Europe, the hard security threats in Europe, were perceived as zero. I think we were dreaming for 1,000 years of peace, and all the energies into the defense sector moved towards soft security. It was a wave of concerns coming in 2001 when we engaged together into the war on terror, and we've started to deploy troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq, which boost a little bit the industry and the need for military equipment, but directed towards stability and support operation. Again, hard threats were zero. In our strategic documents, we were thinking that in the short, medium, and long term, there are no peer adversaries in the horizon. What was the consequences? The rate of consumptions, the replacement of the equipment, everything had a specificity that drove the industrial complex to diminish their production and to produce whatever was necessary for this type of threat. Suddenly, the clouds of hard power threats came over Europe. For Romania, probably earlier, because after the invasion of Ukraine, Romania engaged in programs of procurement, because I used to discuss before with the colleagues in the panel that being here, you feel the breath of the bear. And we've started ambitious program to improve our capacity to respond to an aggression against Romania. And these programs included long-range air defenses, long-range fires, fourth generation multi-role airplanes, and also command and control system, modernizing our individual equipment, APCs for the infantry. So all these programs started a little bit earlier. And then the shock came for all of us with the invasion, illegal attack against Ukraine, and we started to realize that the hard power is here. And I will quote General Cavoli: if somebody attacks you with a tank, you cannot respond with a soft tool. You need a hard equipment to fight that tank. And also, we face now mass, while we were orientated toward precision and high-end capabilities. Now there is a need for balance between mass, cheap mass equipment, and high-end, very expensive equipment. This balance is very difficult. The industry, I think, tried to keep the pace with us, tried to keep the pace with the urgent requirements, because in this relation between options and existent tools, we have one constant. All the time, we as end user, we have urgent requests with complex capabilities, with very, very tight requirements, in order not to be able only to fight today, but to be able to cover and fight the next war, which is, again, a huge problem. And then there are a lot of variables into the defense sectors. Let's talk about the chain of supply, talking about the evolution of prices. Let's talk about the workforce crisis. So all of these are variables for the industry, and again, me as an end user, I don't want to look at that. I'm looking to the constant. I need this, I need fast, I need tomorrow, because I have to defend my country. So this is the dilemma, and this is the, let's say, the broad image where the endowment programs of the Romanian Armed Forces are today. We are working together with the counterparts in the industry, with the counterparts in the political body, in order to help us to acquire as fast as possible whatever is needed to build up the capabilities required by the Romanian people to defend them, but also required by NATO and the EU to contribute to the common security policy of EU or to the defending of the alliance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Andrew, European countries' armies are now buying a lot of American stuff. For example, Czech Republic and Romania now are negotiating about the F-35s. What is the perspective from the Washington with this question of what industry can not only offer but also produce on time and mass?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this really important conference and to the organizers for a terrific event. To your question, look, I think it's true about the US and about Europe that we urgently need to rebuild the defense industrial capacity that we reduced during the so-called peace dividend era, the end of history, the 20 years of global war on terror, overseas contingency operations and whatnot. The defense sector is not a charitable sector. They operate based on contracts and demand that's put in front of them. So the message I would argue from both European governments and a number of US administrations over the last 30 years has been that we need to move to maximum efficiency, just-in-time delivery, limited stockpiling, limited redundancies. So the industry responded with consolidation. So we went from about 50, 51 principal defense and space contractors at the end of the Cold War through consolidations to mainly 5 principals. And that means that the production lines are constrained. The same goes for production of ammunition. And all of that worked pretty well because during the 20 years of overseas contingency operations, we could actually plan quite effectively what stockpiles we needed, what we needed to deploy, force generation issues. We controlled our logistics were not under threat. All of that is now going out of the picture. So we need to move from just-in-time kind of mentality to just-in-case, redundancies, stockpiling. There will be missiles flying at those ships and airplanes in case there is a conflict. We need to have the capacity in our industry to produce at scale. And here there's a problem because of the extent to which, and this is also true about Europe, it's the contraction of the defense sector. In our case, it's also the extent to which we shed some of the manufacturing capacity through offshoring and globalization. So we need to reshore these critical supply chain networks, number one. And that means that the governments need to move. They need to issue contracts. They need to streamline acquisition processes. That's the first thing. And then secondly, we need to get into a kind of new urgency about the nature of the threat. I just returned from 7 years working in Germany for the Defense Department. I was previously in different positions in Europe, and now being back in Washington, I'm struck by the fact that what we lack in our policy discourse is a sense of urgency of the timelines and how quickly we need to get ready in the event there is a crisis. We have the largest war in Europe we've had since 1945. That theater has now widened because of the conflict in Israel and the possible escalation, should Hamas be now complemented by Hezbollah. This will become then a major regional conflict that's draining US resources, pulling us in a different direction. Another potential crisis, say in the Balkans, or an escalation through North Korea, or the biggest nightmare for us is the Indo-Pacific. If we don't start building up at scale munitions productions, weapons productions, then we may be caught in a situation where we will have the most exquisite precision weapon systems, but we'll run out when it becomes a numbers game. And I think that's what the politicians have to understand, not today, but yesterday.
Thank you. Radu, you can play a role of the European on the panel. I know that you cannot play the role of the expert on the industry, but
yes.
For example, if I compare Czech Republic and Romanian approach, in Romania, defense industry is mostly state-owned. In Czech Republic, it's vice versa. It's private. It was privatized, or it's private. So what's the state of the play of the industry in Romania, and how it's going to play with the Europe?
I will start my intervention by quoting NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, that often said in the last year, NATO has two threats to face: Russia, aggressive, assertive, and terrorism. And we are all understood that those are concrete threats, not theoretical. So from this point of view, I think we all allies, not only Romania or Czech Republic, we all have a certain responsibility to understand that we have to invest to prevent the war and the terrorism to expand. We don't have to wait for the wars to be on our frontiers. We don't have to wait for the terrorist threats to be, let's say, a daily breaking news in our capitals, in our cities. So from this point of view, I want to propose all of you an idea that we all allies, especially NATO and EU, have to make a brave decision. I think we should have a certain percentage of the GDP to prevent the war and the terrorists to expand. Of course, we have this allied recommendation, 2% of GDP for defense. I think is a little bit general after the war started. And we are facing the threat here in Europe, and we are facing this difficult, very difficult issue of state-sponsored terrorism in the Middle East and the aggression against Israel. So my idea is to propose 0.1 of GDP of all NATO allies to prevent the war and terrorists to expand. when we are thinking about spending money, also Jens Stoltenberg said, it's only an effort to our very good lives and peaceful and nice living that we have. It will be only an effort of money. The others are losing lives and maybe countries. So 0.1 of GDP to prevent the war and the terrorists to expand, just think what our strongest ally will mean 0.1 of GDP. United States have $23 trillion GDP. 0.1 of GDP will mean 23 billion. Right now, United States is giving more than 23 billion as security assistance for Ukraine and helping Israel to fight terrorism. But let's have an exercise in thinking what will mean 0.1 of GDP of G7 countries. What will mean 0.1 of GDP for 31, I hope, very soon 33 NATO members. What will mean 0.1 GDP for all the 50 countries from defense contact group in Ramstein. So from my calculations, we will have something like $100 billion per year to prevent the war to expand, to prevent the Russian aggressive, assertive posture to come closer to Europe, and also to fight terrorism. 100 billion effort for us, it could be sustainable, because then we have the other 99.9% of GDP of money to have our peaceful, profitable, and comfortable lives. And if we make this decision that from 2% of the GDP for defense and security, we can have 0.1 to prevent the war to extend, then those money could go every year on an institutional base, because right now we have the coalition of the willing. Right now we have countries who are willing to support Ukraine to fight the Russian aggression. We have the coalition of the willing to help Israel to fight terrorism. But we need an institutional decision. We need to assume that in the next 5-7 years, we will still have those threats. And 100 billion will go right now to Ukraine and Israel, but tomorrow could be for another country. God forbid, but we need to face this reality. So defense industry is working on money and orders. If we have the money, we can give the orders. If we have this courage to take the decision, then we will have a perspective. We could be more resilient. And of course, there will be no more problems with delivering arms and ammunition to our partners, to our allies, and now to our friends that are fighting wars of invasion and terrorism. So this is my idea, and I just can expect to have the debate on. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that the mother of all questions in this area is how to persuade politicians, how to go from the nice words into practical terms, orders. Is there any kind of magical solution, gentlemen, for this? You know, not just to speak about it, but how to force them, you know, because we had a, for example, initiative to give the €500 million for the ammunition initiative, but it was not supposed to go to the production lines. It was supposed to go to the bureaucracy around that. So, and you spoke about sense of urgency. Is there anything more? Yes.
Okay, so I think that there are two issues here. One is that I think the biggest challenge will be for NATO to come up with a genuinely shared nature of the threat or the intensity of the threat perception. What you have in Europe right now is a regionalized security optics. You've got political consensus that we are confronting something unprecedented because the Russians have violated repeatedly some of the core principles of territorial integrity and everything that the transatlantic community stands for. But at the same time, the intensity of that threat is kind of regionalized across the geography of Europe. So if you go to Helsinki or Bucharest or in Romania, or you go to Warsaw or Tallinn, there's a very keen sense of the existential nature of the threat. And these countries are the countries, if you look at the F-35 orders that the Finns are putting in, the Poles, Romanians, I think Czech Republic is moving in that direction, the amount of armor that's being ordered and the rest of it, that reflects that consensus on the nature of the threat and its intensity. But that begins to change in terms of appetite for risk-taking as you start moving across Western Europe. Because nations live in neighborhoods in the final analysis. How your 360-degree environment is shaped, that determines your political willingness to act. And I'm bringing this up to say, during the Cold War, it didn't really matter when you were confronting the Warsaw Pact, where you were on that map, whether you were in Paris or London or Bonn, you were exposed to the same threat level in the event of a conflict. This was overwhelming, this was understood. So the first thing is, I think there's a lot of political work to be done within the alliance and at the bilateral government-to-government level to bring the alliance closer into that understanding of what's at stake. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is we're democracies. So you need to speak to the public. You need to communicate to the electorate what's at stake, which means the leaders need to actually address their citizenry and say why we're being asked to spend money on defense, and continue to reinforce that message. Conversations. I'm back in the US now, 7 years in Germany, I'm in Washington. It's the corporate town. I mean, if you do national security, that's where everything is happening. But I sometimes have a feeling we should do more convening in Chicago, in Minneapolis, go into the heartland and present these issues. And I think you need to do the same thing in Europe. Again, not just have an in-house kind of in-the-bubble conversation, but speak in terms that resonate with the public, and I think that's very, very important. Final comment, money. I am sick and tired of percentages of GDP, conversation. To me, that's always been a political cop-out, because you can spend 10% of your GDP on defense. If 80% of this goes to personnel, retirement, and all of that, what capabilities are you really producing? And I think if you look at the 3 regional plans that General Cavoli developed that were approved at Vilnius, the capabilities targets, we should talk in terms of what specific forces each country should provide to the alliance that he can tie into his battle plans, what kind of exercise skill sets they need to develop. And so the percentages of GDP are good indicators because they're indicators of political will. But what you really need is the real substantive military capabilities. And I hope I don't offend anybody in this room, but this is a very wealthy continent, ladies and gentlemen. It's got probably twice as much population as the United States, roughly. It's been rolling in butter for the last 30 years, no offense. Against this, you have in the line a pale shadow of the Soviet Union, less than half of the population of the USSR. The Soviets had 54 non-Soviet Warsaw Pact divisions at the drop of a hat. It was sitting in the heart of Europe, occupying 1/3 of Germany. The China was nothing. I mean, this was the scope of the threat. So if you look at it right now, are you telling me Europe is not capable to produce the conventional deterrent element, the core in NATO, with the US providing the nuclear strategic component, high-end enablers, and of course our portion? It's going to be very hard to sell to the US Congress that 5 or 6 or 7 years from now, not much has changed when it comes to rearmament in Europe. Bottom line, you need to rearm. you are more than capable to provide the core deterrent conventional capability and, if need be, defeat Russian aggression should it come to that. But it takes political will.
General.
Don't get mad at me.
Connecting with this dot, how to persuade public, how to persuade politicians that it's necessary to go this direction. It reminds me, in Czech Republic, the Czech army had to do a big kind of campaign to persuade the public that it's worth to buy F-35s and that spend this money in this direction. Are you here in Romania in this situation that you have to explain every day again and again why it's necessary, or is it the discussion? You don't have to tell any secrets from the cabinets, but if you tell, we will be happy. But where is the discussion here in Romania on this? And you just described necessity to invest, to revive domestic industry, to invest it more.
We are a little bit lucky in this respect because we have a more than 300 history with Russians. And whenever the Russians came into the Romanian principalities and then in Romania, the Romanian people suffered. So it's no doubt that Romanians do not love Russians. This is why Russia was perceived all the time as a threat for Romanians. This is why when you come to explain our people that we need to defend against Russians, the Romanian people understand. It's something that is embedded in the collective mind. It's something embedded in the behavior of Romanians. But looking at the threat, and again, geography matters. NATO is speaking about the eastern flank. Romania is on the front. We are not on the eastern flank. We are a front country. If Russians come to our border, we will be the front, the first line of own defense for NATO. And if they pass us, they will move into the Hungary. They will move into Bulgaria. That means we are on the front. And in this respect, the capability you need have to cover a multi-domain operation. Of course, you mentioned the regional plans and what happened in NATO in the last, let's say, 2 years and a half. It's something that it doesn't happen in the history after the fall of the Iron Curtain. So these plans are not, the universal panacea. These are drivers to help us as NATO members to transform our armed forces in order to face this type of threat. Yes, of course, the plans have list of forces. Yes, of course, the plans needs to be filled with forces, and there are a lot of processes going on, starting from changing the NATO defense planning process to align the planning process to the requirements of the plans, moving into a new force model, which put the readiness of the forces on the forefront. So there are a lot of transformations and processes in NATO, and all the countries align their national defense plans with these NATO plans in order to ensure a synchronization in time and space and the convergence of effects in order to avoid duplication. And all these, if we come to an end, moves into required of capabilities. If you want to build a capability, you need equipment, you need ammunition, you need communication systems, you need ISR equipment, intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance, and all of them come together to counter the most dangerous course of action that NATO and nations foreseen for this threat. So this is how we are working. So we are working on plans The plans moves into capabilities, capabilities goes in, as you mentioned, orders for the industry have to respond. So this is what we are doing now. And it's very difficult. And as you mentioned, we do not have to convince our grandparents or parents with 2% of the GDP. Starting from this year, we have 2.5 of the GDP. And of course, you've mentioned not to waste, but to use money in other directions. It is not the case for Romania. So in 2022, out of 2% of the GDP, we put 22% of these into the acquisition. And this year, we have 37% of the 2.5 into the acquisition. So it's very important. Also, we put money into research and technology. It's a part of the defense budget set for this. So I think Romania is on a good track on this. But again, we are facing some shortfalls, and I mentioned some of them, those variables of the defense industry. We have complex and sometimes very difficult acquisition processes. Then we have now a list of wait. You need to wait until the industry is able to deliver what they promise. But what is to be done is to have predictability to allow the industry to restart and to move into growing their capacity. And meantime, to have that strategic patience, which is difficult to maintain, because as I mentioned, we need to fight tonight and to prepare for the future war. So these are the complexity of the problem. But I think predictability is the best way to allow the industry to follow a long-term path in order to fulfill our urgent requirements on request. I don't know, I'm not a manager of an industrial enterprise, but I think they need some time to build up this capability, to be able to transition very fast from a peacetime establishment into a crisis and then into a war production. This is, I think, the
previously, how shall we move from nice discussions to implementable solutions for this? And I will rephrase this: how shall we move from contemplating the problem to really solving the problem? The wars are fought with arms and ammunition. Mr. Michta mentioned that those percentages, are nice, but won't solve by themselves the problem. And I was wondering, because I know for a fact that nobody in the industry will shy away for receiving help in boosting their capacities. And I know for a fact that there are out there business enterprises that are still waiting for the papers to be signed in some cabinet in order for them to start production of ammunition and arms. And my question is, who should solve this problem? Is this a problem that in times of crisis should stay only with state authorities, or should we move this at the next level, at the international one, at the NATO level? Thank you.
Gentlemen.
Thank you for the question. This is the never-ending conversation about domestic defense industry and the obvious reasons why governments want to protect those industries, and what the STANAGs are and what the alliance needs as a whole. I don't think NATO can actually do it in terms of stimulating the spending and giving contracts on that kind of basis. But I think there are things that NATO can do that can change our competitive position. During the Cold War, we had, so-called COCOM restrictions in NATO, Coordinating Committee on Exports. So you couldn't sell dual-use technology to our adversaries in the Soviet bloc. We have abandoned all of that when globalization hit and, end of history and all that nonsense. And so we actually shipped entire production lines, technologies. I'm not talking about selling products. I'm talking about the entire technological culture that took generations to develop, to a 1.4 communist totalitarian state, and build a story around it that, of course, as middle class rises, it'll democratize, Jeffersons will rise, and everybody will be happy. And we created a monster. So one of the parts of that conversation on capacity is reshoring. It's building up, but it's also reshoring, or at least friendshoring some of our supply chains. You cannot go into a conflict with an adversary and rely on that adversary on some of the basic stuffs. You need to have capacities. So here it's long overdue for the alliance to get together and say, hey, we're going to stop the leakage of technology, especially to China. But to a large extent, the reason the Russians have improved some of their systems, if you look at submarine propulsions, some of the hypersonics, it's access to Western technology. We've allowed our adversaries unfettered access to our entire societies, our educational systems, our labs. In effect, we're training their weapons designers in our universities, for crying out loud. Just to give you a snippet, 2019, I did some research before COVID happened. We had about 1 million foreign students in the US, and universities love foreign students. They come in, pay full tuition, don't complain, wonderful. 370,000 of those at that time were Chinese grad students in STEM, okay? We were also allowing for direct commissioning of research, some of it funded actually from public sources. This is insane. This has to end. And what I find very disturbing is that as tensions build up, and remember that the Russians and the Chinese are building up their militaries not to deter us. They have very clear plans. The Russians have already shown what they intend to do. They intend to reconquer the empire, rebuild the sphere of influence. Quintessentially revisionist state. Putin is relitigating 1991. The Chinese want to basically replace the structures that the US and its democratic allies put in place with one built around their own values, institutions, economic power, and the rest of it. So it's way past time for us to wake up and say, okay, I have relatives in Tennessee. There's a saying, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging, right? So I don't know if the Chinese can outcompete us on AI or not. There's some people who are saying, oh, they already have. I don't know. Let's see. But the current system, where, when COVID hit, 80% of our antibiotics were coming from China, for crying out loud. Capacities in the manufacturing sectors have to be there. You have to have redundancies. So cut off the bleed, governments move, change tax structure, provide incentives, provide contracts, streamline acquisition processes. There are countries in Europe where it's impossible to get from the order through actual approval to the actual contract. So lead times for ammunition, for example, are staggering in some countries. And that's not because there's no capacity. It's this whole bureaucracy that remains in place and all the laws and the rest of it.
You speak about Czech Republic or Romania now?
No. May I just make one point which is very important, because the general said something very, very critical, that you need all those systems to create capacities and capabilities, anything from equipment, munitions, comms and the rest of it. You also need manpower. And I have been talking for quite some time about the fundamental question whether the current all-volunteer force model is actually capable of providing the kind of reserves that we need in the event of an all-state-on-state conflict. The Ukrainians today have the largest army in Europe, okay? And they're beginning to face the reality of what attrition means on the battlefield in terms of population losses. The Russians have about 1 to 4 population advantage right now. And we've been so, tied into the talk about mobility, precision. Well, mobility and attrition are part and parcel of the same conversation. So we need to relearn these things. And I love the example of Finland. Tiny population in relative terms, 5.5 million. The Finns can go from, I don't know what it is, 70,000 to 280,000 at the drop of a hat. Why? Because they have national service from the age of 18 to 60. And in a critical time, they can go up to 800,000. They can't sustain it because they don't have population depth, but that tells you about the ability to surge manpower that you need. Look at the recruitment shortfalls in the US military, in European militaries. It's not just a question of incentives, it's trained reserves, right? It's the redundancy, I call it R&R, it's not rest and recreation. It's redundancies and reserves. That's what we need to change in our thinking about manpower.
Radu, you wanted to react on this? Paperwork in Romania?
Just 30 seconds. If we need ammunition, we need orders. If we need orders, we need money. If we need money, we need percentage of GDP. I know Andrew is sick and tired, and he's right. If we need certain percentage of the GDP, we need politicians. Do we have the politicians to face the reality that we are fighting a war? I don't think so. Because the military, they know what they need in order to fight a war. They need HIMARS, they need Patriot, they need 155 ammunition, everything. Do we have the politicians? I don't think so. We have a good example of Netherlands, which has a great reaction. And it's so brave, because on Monday we will inaugurate the F-16 Center of Training in Europe, the first one in Fetești. And the Dutch F-16s are here. From 31 NATO members, how many members gave F-16 to the Ukrainians, which is a brave decision? 2, the Dutch and the Denmark. So brave decisions needs brave politicians. Otherwise, the military, they do know what they need. Thank you.
I want only to address the question. I think the question was, are we alone in an island, or we were collaborative to solve the problem? So I think there are a lot of mechanisms. And probably you know NATO Support and Procurement Agency at NATO level. I can tell you that at this moment there are contracts ongoing for ammunition procurement through NSPA. We have the Permanent Structured Cooperation Mechanism in Europe, and there are a lot of projects that are ongoing, and the companies can enroll in these type of projects. Also, European Defence Agency assumed a role of agent between nations and industry in order to build up the so-called collaborative procurement process, and a lot of nations involved into different projects built up by ADA, EDA. So there are ongoing processes, and Romania is part of, for example, 12 projects for PESCO system, and it's just an example. But also the Romanian armed forces, they want to keep the connection with the national industry and to keep the contracts that we have ongoing and to develop the links between the Romanian armed forces and, of course, as Radu mentioned, we are in a position that the money, they are here, so we need a competitive industrial market where to go and choose whatever is within the frame of the money we have, but with the qualities that we require. So this is, I think we are not alone. Of course, there are, as I mentioned, a lot of variables into the European industrial market, defense industrial market. There are a lot of variables, but this type of, let's say, collaborative work help every nation to get itself into the process and then to take whatever they need.
I would add only to that it's also a question for us from the eastern part of EU how to tap for the money from the EU. There was a recent study that 2/3 of the European Defence Fund in 2021 went to the 4 Western countries' companies. So it's also the question of our own ability to go into the Brussels, to say so, and ask and get the money. Unfortunately, we have a last question, so please, very brief.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be brief. Andrei Lupu is my name. I'm a member of the Chamber of Deputies, the Defense Committee. So I have a question exactly on what General Bondar was trying to say. We do have the money, but another strategic question is, where do we buy from? We can buy, and we do buy from a lot of places right now, but let's look at the US. We'll have elections next year. We don't know how will the next government look towards collaborating with Europe regarding defense equipment. We do buy as well from Asian countries, from South Korea, from Israel, and when I say we, I'm not referring only to Romania, but we might have a conflict in the South Asia Sea. We have a conflict in Israel. A third option is to keep buying from different European countries, as Mr. Bondar was saying. For the moment, we have a mix of all of them, but we cannot be sure that we'll have this for the coming months or years. Conflict might start everywhere. Political changes might come from any place. So what should be our strategic decision regarding on what do we spend money on and exactly from where do we get the most important equipment? Thank you.
Gentlemen, please be short. I know the answer.
I think it's very important to understand that every procurement program passes a competitive bidding process. The provider comes in the end. So, as I mentioned, what capabilities do you need? How much money do you have? What do you need to do with those capabilities? All these comes into a process that there are requirements for the mission, operational requirements, and a lot of probably very long process of procurement. And then you have the political guidance. And you know for sure that for above a certain amount of money, we go to the parliament to have a decision on the acquisition. So I think the decision finally comes to the representatives of the people, because the contract goes into the parliament, what we want to acquire, and then goes to the specialists, the subject matter experts that they deal with this. So I think of course, from where we come, as I mentioned, we need to take into consideration the risk of supply chain. When you build up these documents, the requirements for the operational requirements, you need to take this into consideration. You need to take into consideration the offset offered with the contract. There are a lot of variables that comes into the acquisition process, but I'm not a specialist. There are subject matter experts that are working on this, and I'm sure there is no doubt that in the end, the army received what they need. This is because it starts from us, and the product comes into our, let's say, military units. So.
Thank you very much. No,
Just very
we
quickly.
are over time, so
Yeah,
please.
just very quickly. Start not with systems. This is a toolbox. Start with what your strategy is, what the theater looks like, what your military requirements are to actually get to those goals, and then put the tools. This is a system of systems conversation. And unfortunately, because of Ukraine, there's been this fascination with one magic bullet, the F-35, the F-16, the Abrams, this. No. It's what are your strategic objectives, how you operationalize those objectives, what your military strategy is.
Radu Tudor.